Welcome to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast, where we help women struggling with recurrent pregnancy loss by sharing stories of hope and interviews with experts in the field of fertility and miscarriage. If you want to download our free lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, you will go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to download your free checklist. If you want to connect with others going through recurrent miscarriage, please check out our show notes for a link to our Facebook group. Now I'm going to hand it over to your host, Laura Bowder, for today's episode.
Welcome back to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast. Today I have Jackie Figueras with me. She is a passionate pregnancy loss specialist, a registered nurse, and a certified coach. And over half of her 18-year career has been dedicated to pediatrics, where she learned how to connect with parents during the most stressful and often painful times. She builds trust quickly and provides a safe, non-judgmental space in which barriers are broken down and growth can flourish. So I am really excited to have a conversation with you today. Jackie, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Laura and Allison. I am so honored to be a part of the Miscarriage Hope Desk podcast. I love your mission, and it aligns so closely with everything that I'm trying to do for the fertility community as well.
Yeah, so we really appreciate you being here. And I'd love to start out with giving you a chance to tell us a little bit more maybe about your personal story and how that has kind of brought you to the place where you are and the mission that you have today.
Yeah, absolutely. Personal story is everything in my life. So I will try to be concise because we did have quite a long journey, as so many women have and couples have. So we had 4 consecutive miscarriages. So the first one was at 5 weeks and was not, officially diagnosed. So it was given the horrible label, which I despise, the chemical pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one was at 8 weeks, and again, termed chemical pregnancy. And I quickly learned to hate that label. Yep. And then our third miscarriage was when I really hit rock bottom and when I learned a lot about grief. So we had done IUI, and I'm a very type A neurotic personality who does everything to the umpteenth degree, and I was going to nail it, right? And we got pregnant with the first IUI, and I was like, I did it. We did it, right? We did it. And that was a really, really tough loss for us. So at 7 weeks, we found out that it was a blighted ovum, which took me years to even be able to say out loud, because it really felt as though it wasn't termed like a real pregnancy then at that point. Since then, I'm like, F that. Sorry if I can say that on your podcast, but that is what I felt. And what was really hard with that loss was that my body was so primed to maintain a pregnancy that for 5 more weeks, I remained pregnant with a baby that I knew was not surviving. And so ended up having to take the cytotec medication. And that was the worst experience of my life. So for anybody out there who has experienced that, humongous hugs, because that was definitely very, very traumatic. I was not prepared, was not given enough information. And I have an amazing doctor, but still was very downplayed. So I talk about that a lot because that is such a misconception for so many. And it's really scary. And so many of us who have gone through that have said you kind of feel like you really are dying, like you just don't know what's even happening with your body. And not to be scary, but just to shed light on that if anybody has ever felt that, they're not alone. So that was the worst experience for sure. And that's what really started triggering me, like, wow, I'm not okay. The grief was so compounded because I had just been kind of one of those people who was like, I'm just going to plow through it, right? I'm a nurse, just going to do it, take care of myself, everything's okay. And I couldn't do that after the third loss. So we then decided to try one final last time right after Christmas, and we got pregnant with twins. So that was like, oh my gosh, that's an infertility woman's dream, right? You're 2, 1 and done. You don't have to worry about this again. And then we did see one of the babies wasn't growing as strongly as the other. And then at 13 weeks was the last time that we got to see that baby's heartbeat. So that was also really, really difficult to grieve because I still had to fight to save the baby that was strong inside of me. So it was really difficult to grieve. So my whole passion, everything to do with my personal mission is to support anybody who's struggling, to provide input for the medical community because I'm a nurse, my husband's a nurse, and we felt so lost and confused. And people would assume like, but you're a nurse, but we don't learn about miscarriages or infertility at all in your nursing career. I mean, unless you go into infertility and you're a nurse in that world, you don't learn about it. So I was so frustrated with the lack of compassion and even the lack of like handouts and education. And so that's another reason why I love Miscarriage Hope Desk, because you guys align so closely with me of getting that medical information out there that just doesn't exist. And I'm not sure why. So I'm on the mission to change that and hopefully one day change fertility and healthcare for good. But that's really what has driven me to put myself out there, to share my story, and to provide facts and practical tips to anybody who needs it.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that you know that we have a very similar mission. And
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate you sharing, the different experiences that you've had
Mm-hmm.
throughout your journey. You mentioned that taking the cytotech, for example, is something that is often just kind of brushed under the rug. Like, oh, well, you have to do it because
Right.
your body, I guess, in another, cruel twist of fate, is not working well
Right.
enough to then get rid of this pregnancy that is never going to result in a baby. And that's heartbreaking. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, I've had conversations with other guests on this podcast that like, it's important to have that medical perspective, but so often then we kind of leave out that mental health side of things.
Yeah.
Like, how do people feel when they go through this? Like, yes, we understand that we have to do the medical side of things and
Mm-hmm.
it needs to be done for our health and in your case for another baby's health that was
Mm-hmm.
with your twins. Like, there are medical things that have to happen, but you're kind of left feeling unsupported or with a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to some of the other pieces of your experience.
100%. Yes. And so, I have created a lot of information on exactly what you just mentioned. So it's perfect because I have a handout that I provide that talks about the mental, emotional, and physical aspects of all of that because you can't have one without the other. And that's what I tried so hard to do. Like, strong woman, career oriented, type A, I was not going to let it get me down. But the second loss was really hard for me. And again, just the lack of information provided. So I'd gone into my doctor's office, I was bleeding, and I've shared this too, where I wanted to punch the MA in the face because she was just so sweet and bubbly and had no clue why I was there. Right. And so walking in like, hi, how are you? And I'm like, horrible. I think I'm losing my baby right now, and I was having one of those days, and especially the nurse in me came out and I actually spoke with the manager because I wanted them to change their practice, that they should ensure that they spend the 10 seconds to look at somebody's reason for being in their office before they enter the room. Because
That's a good point.
yeah, it was so difficult to feel like so unheard. I hadn't been heard. I'd called the office. I had filled out the paperwork. I had talked to the front desk, and it's like nobody was listening to me. And I felt like that kept coming. And I love healthcare providers. I am one, right? But I also know how busy people can get and how just go with the flow, kind of that conveyor belt type thing, because the way that healthcare is set up of just having so many appointments back to back. But I can't emphasize just how much of a difference it would have made for me in any of my losses to have had somebody just come in and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We're going to find out what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't take much, but it's so profound. And it can just
Yes.
help someone feel so acknowledged immediately and just be like, oh, somebody cares. And that's what I just felt there was such a lack of.
Right. Well, and I think it sets up that kind of dynamic or that feeling right from the beginning, then that, like, okay, this is going on, but we don't talk about it. We
Yep.
pretend everything is fine and we're just not going to discuss what's actually going on here. We're just two people in a doctor's office for a reason that we are not currently discussing.
Yeah. And, you know, talking about the physical aspect of it a little bit too, was that after my first loss, I didn't even know what was happening. I was like, am I losing my baby? Like, what's happening? And I went to work the next night. I worked night shift that time, and I worked in pediatrics at that time. So I was miscarrying while I was working a 12-hour night shift, and just so fatigued and like just not understanding what was going on and what I should be doing. You try to Google stuff, and I'm a nurse, so I try to look like research studies. I don't just use, Google doctor. I actually use legitimate things, and there just isn't a lot out there. And then with my second loss, I actually rode in a bike race. So I had signed up for a charity bike race. So 2 weeks after, I was supposed to ride 75 miles. And 25 miles of the 50 miles that I was actually able to complete, I just cried. I was by myself. I couldn't keep up with my team. Nobody stayed with me. And I remember just being so tired and crying so hard. And looking back, it's like, what? Why would you think that you could ride even 10 miles, much less 75? And then I was so mad at myself for only completing 50. I mean, that's how like messed up it is in the community, that we don't even say like, you're going to go through postpartum. Your hormones are going to wipe you out, and you're going to be on a roller coaster, and it's going to be just, this is what's going to happen, and that you should take care of yourself, just like after you have a baby, because you are essentially delivering a baby, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is something I talk about so much too, is the physical aspect of it. But then, yes, as you mentioned, the emotional aspect of it. So how do you grieve, and how do you take care of yourself emotionally too? So I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit more, or the physical aspect. I'm not quite sure where you want to go.
No, I mean, I think they both fit together pretty well too, but I mean, I can definitely relate to that experience, and just not knowing like, what am I supposed to do, and feeling like, okay, well, I can't tell anybody about what's going on because, whatever we have built up in our heads for why we're not talking about it. I had an early miscarriage as well, and went back to work like the next day because I was like, well, how am I going to tell anybody why I'm not at work? So I just went back like everything was fine, because that's what we do, just go on like everything's fine. So I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit about, like you said, how should we, think about taking care of ourselves during this kind of postpartum experience that we're having. So I think that kind of encompasses the physical aspect of that, but also the grief that comes along with that. Yeah. At what point do we start trying to figure out, like, do I go back to work, to life as normal? What kind of time and space do I give myself while this is going on?
Yeah, and that's such a good question. And it's one I get a lot. I have a lot of nurses who reach out to me who are in pediatrics or labor and delivery, because imagine your trigger being your job.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to go to work, period. But when you're going to work and you're dealing with people delivering their own babies and that joy, so hard. So a couple of things physically that I like to share often is the medical aspect of it, right? So understanding that you are essentially delivering a baby in your first trimester or in your second trimester, right? And so you are going to have bleeding. So for some people, it can be heavy bleeding with a lot of clots and a lot of cramps, and you can actually sometimes have those contractions. And that's also something that's not talked about. Like, you might actually feel some of those labor issues. So you might have that lower back pain, the extreme uterine contractions, and they might last for 1 to 3 days. They can last for a week or two. So I just want people to understand that as well. And that you do want to pay attention to how much bleeding. So that the typical is, 1 pad in an hour. So you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on that too. And then as far as your hormones, it can take 4 to 6 weeks, which is also not talked about. Like, everybody thinks you're just going to be okay in a couple days. And like, once the bleeding is done, well, then it's done. But that's not what happens. Just like in postpartum, your hormones were all excited and ready to nourish this baby in your body. And so it takes a while for those to come down. So I know the dreaded beta test that everybody talks about, the HSG, and how you have to keep coming. And it's like, why do I have to keep coming back to this office? Why do I have to keep getting this blood work that's just telling me over and over again that I'm losing my baby? Like, it's so hard. I remember I just was like, why do I have to keep going back? Well, that's why, because they do want to make sure your hormones are getting closer to baseline before you start again. And so I do want people to kind of understand the why behind that, because I also don't think that that is often shared. It's just that we have to keep coming in until it gets to baseline, but they don't talk about why. And then the other question I get so much is, when can I try again? And so that's going to be after you've had a full cycle. So that could be 4 to 8 weeks for people. It just completely depends on your body, what stage you were, what your HSG was, and how long it takes to come back down. So those are some of the physical aspects, just to give people an idea of like a lot of the questions that I get asked. As far as grieving, I could spend 5 days talking about grieving and trying to figure that out. But the number one thing is to rest. As you and I both talked about, we didn't do that, right? So many people don't, because how do we talk about it? So I want people to know legally, at least in the US, if you're listening, you do not have to give a reason when you call off work, and they are not legally allowed to ask you why. So you don't have to disclose that information, which I think can feel really safe, where I can just say I need time off. And so you don't have to share that if you do not have a boss that is going to be understanding. If you do have a company, you can also look at bereavement. So some hospital policies allow you to take the 3-day bereavement. I'm sorry, not hospital, work policies. You can tell where I work in a hospital, but your employer policy, you'd want to have that conversation with your human resource team to find out if you're able to take the 3-day bereavement. But if you have time and you can take that time at work, highly encourage you to take that time off and do nothing. Take the help. If you do have some good people, say yes. I think it's the hardest thing for us. And I don't know if you experience this too, Laura, but people will be like, what can I do for you? And be like, I'm fine. It's okay. I'm fine. Now I'm like, you can come fold my laundry. You can come do the dishes. Like, please come help me. I don't care if you see my underwear. Like, that would be so nice, because those things that require you to bend a lot, which is why I mentioned laundry and dishwasher and washing dishes, that uses your core a lot. You'd be surprised just how exhausted your body can feel when you're going through that. So say yes is another thing that I often want to remind people, because having that little help, let people drop food off. You don't have to visit. Say, I would love if you could just drop some food off. I'm not up for talking right now yet. You know, just those simple little things that if you can say yes, please do, because it will make such a difference, because you cannot take care of yourself if you are trying to do 1,000 things in a day still.
Yeah, those are all really good tips, and all things that I didn't do. So,
Right?
you know, it's good to be able to pass that on to other people and hope that other people will listen and do those things, because it's a lot to try and go through alone. You know, I didn't even really tell anybody who would have been able to drop food off or come and help. So, yeah, I think it's just really important to have that support system and let people know what's going on, so that they can offer that help and you can take them up on it for sure. And I guess another thing that kind of goes along with that is, like, we might have kind of vague ideas about what to expect, but oftentimes we don't have any really clear, specific information about what to expect. And most of us going through this are not medical professionals. Is there anything that stands out to you that you think in general people might not know about, or if there are certain like myths of things that people expect to happen that don't really happen, or anything along those lines?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. So as far as physically what to expect, so it's going to depend. Not everybody has the same experiences, but you know, I think for some people, and I'm going to go emotional and physical. So for some people, it's going to feel like the saddest, most devastating experience of your life. And you might be surprised because of how society treats it. We always get the question, I just did a post on this, how far along were you? I hated that question, because what did it matter? So my response was always long enough to be in love. Because what did it matter if I was 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks? I fell in love. And so for me, that was something that took me a while to be able to even talk about, because I was so in love with the future of this baby in the next 50 years of my life. And so for some people, they may not be as connected, and that's 100% normal too. So one thing I want people to expect is that everybody is going to experience it differently. And I also don't think that's shared about enough, because I have some people who feel guilty who are like, I am not so sad. Is that not normal? And I'm like, however you feel is however you feel. So something that I think is also not talked about is to expect that you're going to feel whatever you feel in your body and in your heart. And that is 100% perfect for you, and to not worry about that with anybody else. What to expect physically, I touched on this a little bit, but that you're going to have a much heavier period than you've experienced. So that's what the doctor tells you, right? That maybe that's the one thing you're told is you're going to have a heavier period. And I'm like, So if anybody is listening to that, it's a lot different. I don't know if you can say that too, Laura, but a little bit different than what you would expect a heavy period. So again, as I'd mentioned it, and I talked about this, and so I do apologize. I'm getting a little bit graphic, but I am that nurse who's on here. So the clots can be alarming, the size of the clots. Depending on where you are in your pregnancy, you also might see a fetus. You might see parts of the fetus. And I think that that can be so alarming and shocking, and just really mess with your mind and your emotions when you see that coming out. And so I think that that needs to be talked about more to help prepare people that that's what's going to be coming out of their body potentially, just so they can be a little bit better prepared. Also, if you want to honor that baby, this is something that sounds so kind of like, really, and kind of ooh, but if it means that to you, there's a lot of talk now about you can put a strainer in your toilet and you can actually collect the clots or collect the baby, and then you can have a ceremony. So you can bury that baby, or if you have had more than one miscarriage, you can have that baby, the tissue, sent to the doctor's office. You can call your doctor's office about that as well too. So those are really medical, not super sensitive things to talk about, but I think that we need to prepare people better for that to happen. So I don't know what I would have done looking back if I would have saved it or not, but the flushing of the toilet, I think, was like, oh, what do I do now? It's in my toilet. My baby's in my toilet. What do I do now? And I've talked to so many women when you don't even want to flush the toilet because you just don't even know what to do. Yeah. And so I just want that to be talked about too, just to help prepare you. So there's nothing wrong with flushing the toilet, but that moment is going to stay with you. And if you're home, that bathroom is going to be a trigger for you. And that's something else I don't think is talked about a lot too, right? We want to be home, but then we also have to realize that our home can become a triggering place for us too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, yeah, like no matter where you are, right? If you're at work, like you said, you went back to work.
Yeah.
It could be that same thing. And I worked in public school, so similarly, like surrounded by children, I mean, there are just certain things like right after that if you don't take that time, you're going to, I mean, no matter what, you will probably find triggers in strange places.
Anywhere and everywhere.
Yeah, they will come up randomly. Your hormones will still be continually in flux over the next several weeks or months. And so you may feel fine one minute and be in tears the next over a commercial or a kid walking down the street, or who knows. Yeah, and I think your point is just, it's so perfect that, however you feel, because, we do spend a lot of time talking about how devastating it is and how sad you can feel. And that might leave some people thinking, I don't feel that way. Is there something wrong with me then? So I think that's a great point to bring up too, is just that everybody grieves differently. This experience brings up all kinds of baggage in different people for different reasons. And, I think probably one of the best things you can do, other than take care of yourself physically, because as we've talked about, physically, there is just all kinds of things going on, but don't forget to take care of yourself, emotionally, take care of your mental health. even if you think you've, put it behind you, if you don't deal with it properly, it will resurface.
Yes. And if I can take a few minutes to talk about that part.
Sure.
So with grieving, because so many times, for the women who are saying, I didn't feel like I lost a baby, but I did have a miscarriage or I did have a pregnancy loss. But what I felt like is I lost so much else. I'm grieving the innocence. I'm grieving what I thought my future is going to be for my family and for my future, right? So you might not feel super connected to the baby, but I have yet to meet somebody who hasn't felt some sort of a loss. And so one of the things I talk about so much with grieving, because I did so much research, because I realized I didn't even really know how to grieve.
Yeah.
I knew how to grieve my grandma. I knew how to grieve my dog, but I didn't know how to grieve the pregnancy loss, because it's just this feeling of like nobody else really is acknowledging it and all of that. So one of the things that I talk about a lot in the science and the brain part of it is that, number one, you don't necessarily have the ability to talk yourself out of it. Like you cannot talk yourself out of trauma. You cannot talk yourself out of grief. And that there are 3 parts in your brain that you actually have to get connected in order to even start grieving. And this is not often talked about. So you have your rational brain, your emotional brain, 2 different sides, and they are not connected. So in order to get them connected, you have to pull into another part of your brain, which is your self-awareness part of your brain. And so if anybody out there is really struggling with grieving, the first things that I always recommend is just to start being aware and accepting and acknowledging where you are in your emotions, how you're feeling. If you're angry, if you're frustrated, if you're just really sad, if you're numb, whatever that is, just start acknowledging and accepting, because the only way that you can get your rational and your emotional brain to start connecting, even start to begin healing, is by increasing your self-awareness. And this was something that I did not know about at all. So much of what I teach and what I talk about and what I help with coaching is just increasing your self-awareness. And it sounds simple, but it's really hard, and it can be really scary, and it can be something that so many people just step away, right? Dealing with your emotions is not easy and it's not fun. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that, because people are often like, it might last years. And people don't understand why, but if you never start connecting those parts of your brain, you can't start moving forward. You can't take that first step, because your brain is going to continue to be detached from those 2 emotions, the rational and emotional part of your brain.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about. And it's a totally different experience, like you said, from the grief that we may be used to experiencing or have experience with in the past. Because there's usually not, we have certain rituals that we go through
Right.
with most losses, and we don't do that in this particular case. And so it can kind of either leave people feeling like it's not, a real loss, like it didn't really happen, or just like, no one else is acknowledging it. So, that's not my place to acknowledge it either. It's just not something that needs to be acknowledged. And so I think it goes back to like letting yourself feel however you want to feel about it, and doing what you need to do to start processing. If people are listening and they're thinking like, okay, maybe I am in that place where like I feel kind of stuck. I might have some of that disconnect going on between the emotional side and the rational side. What would be like a good first step, or good action item that people could take away, as far as maybe just even starting down that processing road?
Yep. So there's 2 different things that I recommend to start with. So one of them is journaling, which I hated. So don't turn this off yet if you heard me say that. But I found 2 different prompt journals. So one is, let me just make sure I get the title correct. Empty Arms. So that was really helpful. I needed prompts, because I wasn't somebody who would just sit down and write. So I needed questions to get me start thinking. And so, if you go on Amazon, and there's tons of resources on my website, and I believe as well on Miscarriage Hope Desk as well too. So prompted journals are really helpful for me, but it helps you start answering difficult questions. If that's not for you, just start writing a couple sentences throughout the week. If you have an emotion come up, put it in your notes on your iPhone, or jot it down on a Post-it or whatever. But just if something triggers you, or you're feeling something, if you write it down, writing using your hand also connects your brain with your heart as well too. And there's a lot of science and a lot of studies behind that as well. The actual motion of using your hand also helps you connect with that at a deeper level than just thinking it in your mind. It brings it forward into the more center of your brain so that your brain can start focusing on that too. Don't recommend doing a lot of that at work. I recommend you being in a quiet place where in case something comes up and you start having a really emotional moment, that you have that time. And then the second thing is to start gauging where you are throughout your day. So it's an activity that you do where when I wake up, how am I feeling? And you can do it on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is I'm the happiest I've ever been. 1 is I don't even think that I can start the day. And you do that throughout your day to start getting a trend. Am I always at a 1 or a 2? Am I going from a 1 to a 7 to a 3 to a 10? Am I just kind of up and down, up and down, up and down, where I don't have any sort of self-regulation on that? Am I at a 7 and is that accurate, or am I faking it? So those are ways that you can just start to help increase the awareness that are simple. This is like the initial phase, right? There's about 20 other steps that it takes to really start increasing your self-awareness to engage your brain and all the different aspects of it. But those are 2 of the ones that I found are easier and kind of safe to start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's great just to have a place to start, because like you said, so many people don't even know where to start, or we just jump right back into what we were doing before and don't take the time to process it. So I think that's really helpful. And what about, like, in your own experience, were you satisfied with the answers that you were hearing from your medical professionals about, why you were experiencing these recurrent losses?
Oh, I know it's so hard because the nurse in me is like, but I love my medical professionals and I never want to throw them under the bus. But part of what I do is because I didn't get the answers or the support. So the first 2 miscarriages were the PCP. I was struggling finding an OB that fit our needs. Then I went to a new OB and was just thrown on Clomid. So if any of you have been on Clomid, it's not something that you just want to be on just because. There wasn't really a reason. Again, I didn't know enough about labs. I actually have like an 10-page lab document as well too. And I think you guys do as well too. So labs are like really big in my world. Just trying to make sure people understand what kind of labs should be looked at and the intensity that they should be looked at. I was just kind of given, oh, your progesterone is a little low. And that was really it. When I went to see my RE, my world lifted because I researched about 6 reproductive endocrinologists, in my community. And I found one who was out of the box, didn't do cookie cutter, wanted to find out what was going on in my environment. So I highly encourage people to do the research first, because there are amazing doctors in this world, but there are some who investigate deeper than others. And I wanted somebody who was going to find out why I was having these recurrent losses and really figure out what I could do. So we did about 6 to 7 months of work on just my environment and my body before we started doing anything like IUI or introducing any sort of hormones. So that's something else that I really empower people, is to ask those difficult questions. If you're not sure what question to ask, reach out to people like myself and Allison and Laura. We can give you a list of questions to ask because we have been there and we understand now. But when you're going through it, it's so difficult to think. And so yeah, I did not get a lot of the answers until I found the right RE. And then I mean, talk about lab work. Woo! But I appreciated it, because I was able to get to the bottom of what was going on with my body. And it was a lot of autoimmune issues because of being a nurse for so long. So my body was attacking my baby, thinking that it was foreign. So we had to immunosuppress my body, had to do a ton of supplements, change my diet, changed everything. But, even with doing that, I still didn't have a viable pregnancy with my first IUI. So I want people to realize that even when you do everything right, there's still genetics involved. There's still the healthiness of the sperm and the egg. So, just taking some of that pressure off as well, because like I said, I tried to be perfect. And that's what also devastated me, was I thought that I could make it happen.
Yes, I think there's a lot of type A people out there like you and me that that think that we can control this and get really frustrated when we can't. So it's really, really hard to feel so out of control. Did they give you any any answers for, the twin that didn't make it?
I mean, essentially just that, I was a little bit older. So my eggs were healthy for my age, but just that the eggs that I was releasing to have my babies just were not healthy eggs, is what, they weren't able to obviously do anything with the twin to get diagnostics on, because we obviously weren't going to go in and do anything with another healthy baby there. But, I had a couple, and my diagnosis were not specific to fertility. And that's what else. There's so many common diagnoses that people go for that align with fertility. And then unexplained fertility to me is such a cop out. Sorry, but I'll just say that, because if you keep digging, there's other issues going on with your body that there is a reason. And so for mine, it wasn't technically what would be considered, oh, that's what's causing me to have miscarriages. But with my body, it absolutely was. And once we found that, it was like, okay, now I felt hope and I felt like there was a chance. But, it still comes down to your body, the right time, healthy egg, healthy sperm. And that's what I think can be so hard, is unless you're getting your embryo mixed with the sperm and having everything outside of your body where you can genetically test it, which a lot of people with miscarriages are not at that point and maybe not necessarily doing IVF yet, you don't know. And that's what's so scary about trying again.
Yeah. It can be terrifying to try again because you don't know what went wrong the first time.
Yep.
And I think especially if you haven't processed appropriately or,
Yep.
taken the time for yourself, there's still all those fears of, is it going to happen again? Can I go through this again? My
anxiety.
Just willingly put myself through that. Did you have any of those thoughts, or like, what was your thought process or your decision-making process like after you had, your healthy child? Were you good with just, okay, we have gone down this journey, we have a healthy child, we're done? Or did some of these other thoughts continue to creep up or play a part in that decision-making?
I always struggle talking about this because I am so blessed that we did have a healthy baby. And I know that can be so hard for some people to hear about. I actually was mentioned by somebody saying that my story is not inspiring because I ended up having a healthy baby, that it makes other people feel, sadder about it. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's the last thing I want to do. So I want to be really sensitive talking about this, but this is ultimately 100% what drove me to want to reach out to people in the beginning. I suffered severe PTSD. The first 6 months after I had my daughter and throughout my pregnancy, my anxiety was so high, especially because I had emergency surgery at 5 weeks, pregnant with my twins. Talking about lack of compassion, I was in the hospital for 12 hours before having any surgery or anything done. I was in a 10 out of 10 pain. I was terrified. I knew it wasn't a miscarriage because I obviously knew what that felt like. I had 3 and I kept saying, this is different. This is so excruciating. And they kept telling me it was an ectopic pregnancy and to not worry about it. And they wanted to do scans and they wanted to do all these things. And so we actually called my RE, and my RE, you could actually hear him yelling on the phone that they were not going to scan me and confirming that I was pregnant with twins because they kept dismissing me. And it was such a traumatic event that I think that changed so much of my life. Just the lack of compassion, how many times we had to keep saying that I was pregnant with twins, I'm pregnant. Even if one is ectopic, there's a healthy baby in there. And why I mention that is because I think that triggered a lot of trauma for me. And so if anybody else has experienced those traumatic experiences when you go into the provider's office or you're at work or wherever it happens, that we have to acknowledge that trauma. But what I didn't realize is that PTSD was a thing for miscarriage. It's associated with military so much. And my husband was military. And so I'm like, I can't say that I had PTSD. I didn't go into a war zone. And as I did more research, it was like, holy shit, I went through a lot of trauma. Wow, having one loss is so much trauma. 2, 3, and then doing the side attack. I mean, just acknowledging that was such a really uncomfortable thing for me. And for 6 months after I had my daughter, I was not sleeping. I was so terrified she was going to die. I would stare at her on the monitor, literally stare at the monitor to see that she was okay. And I started almost going into psychosis because I wasn't sleeping. The first time I had to go back to work, I physically shook the whole day. because I had such a hard time leaving her. And I don't think that postpartum is talked about enough either. And that when you go through fertility and you add hormones to your body, you're at a much higher risk for postpartum anxiety and depression. I think it's like a 48%, I think was the statistic I found, but it's definitely much higher risk for that. And I just want people to be aware of that too, that it doesn't magically, all of your trauma, all of your grief doesn't go away when you hold your baby. I mean, wow, are you like through the moon joyful, but then you also don't even know how to handle all those joyful hormones and those joyful moments that you're feeling too, because you've waited so long for it. And so I actually missed out on about 6 months of my daughter's life because I was so mentally in a state that wasn't present, that wasn't able to enjoy it because I was in so much fear and anxiety.
Yeah. I'm just, anyone who listens to like the beginning few episodes of this podcast heard my story about this. And it's, very similar, not necessarily in, I don't know about intensity or PTSD, but I definitely had a lot of postpartum anxiety and depression. And I think looking back on it now, like exactly like what you were saying, like watching my son, making sure he was breathing, like never wanted to not have him in my eyesight. And I think a lot of it, now I would just attribute back to basically unprocessed, unresolved issues with the miscarriage, because I got pregnant with my son, essentially the first full cycle after my miscarriage. So I did not give myself that time, and it's really important. But I appreciate you sharing your story. I think there's a lot here that people are going to be able to relate to in different ways. I don't for 1 second think your story is discounted because you have a healthy child. There are plenty of people that have miscarriages after having healthy children, plenty that have healthy children after losses. We do want to provide hope that if you are experiencing a loss right now, if you choose to continue to move forward and try again, there's, certainly a possibility that you have a healthy baby at the end of this road through whatever way you ultimately decide is best for you. So, I think there are millions of different ways through this journey. And so we're just here to share different ones and share different perspectives. And so, Jackie, I would love to give you a chance to let the listeners know where they can connect with you if they want to learn more from you or just connect with you to have a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much again for letting me share so much of my story and for acknowledging the inspiration and the how the sharing can be really therapeutic for others too. I genuinely appreciate that as like a woman to woman, of that. So thank you for that, Laura. So how people can find me is jackiefigueras.com is my website. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Jackie Figueras. So everything is the same name all across, trying to make it easy. DM in Instagram is very fast. I respond to everybody. I feel that connection is just so pivotal. And I know how hard it is just to even take that first step. So my heart goes out to anyone who is currently struggling, anyone who has struggled in the past, no matter how long ago. It's never too late to start addressing that grief and to start healing holistically. So I just want to let everybody know that I do hear that often too, but it was so long ago, and that doesn't matter if it matters to you.
Jackie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and don't forget to check out our show notes for details on joining our Facebook group and for following along on Instagram. If you would like a free recurrent pregnancy loss lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, that's miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to get your free downloadable checklist. And for even more resources, visit the Miscarriage Hope Desk website, where we have stories of hope plus an entire library of evidence-based research articles related to fertility and miscarriage. If you enjoyed this episode, I would so appreciate it if you rate, reviewed, and subscribed to the Miscarriage Hope Desk podcast. Your ratings and reviews will help others to find us. I want to wrap up by saying that if you are going through a miscarriage, my heart goes out to you, and as difficult as your experience may be, I want you to know that you are not alone and that you will find a path forward.